So you're interested in explosions, he said, trying to stay family friendly. But when you hear external conflict, that's immediately what comes to mind, just wild stuff happening and building momentum through to the end of the narrative. In its rawest form at least, but action, while synonymous, is not quite the same as conflict. Conflict is simply opposing interests regardless of how it manifests, and I find that part so fascinating, those warring differences. They have a wide variety when you get into the nitty-gritty, but let's put a pin in that. When it comes to fictional conflict, there are some poor souls that get dragged into the matter every single time, and I'm talking about none other than characters. I mean, who else is going to be experiencing all that emotional turmoil? Certainly not me, because what? And in the context of characters, especially their evolution over the course of the narrative, there is usually a focus on internal conflict, the raging contradiction that is human emotion, desires, ambitions, goals. And yeah, that sounds about right. The elements within creating conflict are usually going to be the main driving force behind a character. To me, and I think most people, it's where characters become engaging and compelling. But that got me curious about the other end of the spectrum, and I wanted to do a little study. So kick your feet up and let's get into it. External conflict and the evolution of fantasy characters. But on the topic of character, if you're watching this, you definitely have an original character. So let me tell you about Unveil. Unveil is a platform for artists and writers to share your original characters, as well as the lore surrounding them, which is something I'm going to touch on in this video. So if you get inspired throughout, maybe you could take some of that inspiration there. Just saying. You can create a character page, write up all that juicy lore surrounding them, and it gets incredibly detailed. You can characterize them with specific traits and information and then broadcast that to the world. And speaking of worlds, if your characters share the same universe, you can group them and organize, theme the page how you want, make it a place that really feels lived in. But Unveil also makes it a point to have specifically only human-made art on there, so you don't have to worry on that front. And if you're not quite in the sharing mood yet, you can just cycle through random OCs for inspiration. You guys are probably aware of my unyielding love for art at this point. I have spent many a time clicking that randomize button. If it sounds like something you're into, it's a very simple sign-up process. Link in the description, and thanks to Unveil for sponsoring this video. Okay, much like our characters, our journey into exploration must begin somewhere, and I think I know the perfect place. No, this isn't the perfect place to start. This is a pretty famous distinction, one I'm not the biggest fan of, and if you're familiar with my channel, you probably already have an inkling why. False dichotomies. Oh, you gotta love them. It's a great simplification of concepts, but the deeper you get into storytelling, the more you'll find that things are rarely ever just one way. Which is apt because look at the world around you. And this character versus plot-driven discourse is no exception. But as the names imply, plot-driven is more focused on the happenings of a story, the events pushing the narrative forward. And character-driven, you know what, I would let you take a wild guess. But I bring this up because it feels an awful lot like the internal-external conflict discussion, while not exactly mirroring it. Stories that feel like the character is in the driver's seat tend to have more of a focus on that internal turmoil. I usually like to use speculative examples, but I'm feeling quirky today and I was listening to a jazz playlist while scripting, so let's take a look at Whiplash.
So for the final father time!
No spoilers because I'm only talking about the literal first scene, in which the movie lets you know very quickly that this is about two characters. Neiman's late-night drumming practice turns into the most intense audition when this menace to society walks into the room. Neiman botches it, angry Baldwin leaves, Neiman disappointed. This is about a man and the decision he makes towards his drumming goals. Character, meet driver's seat. Whereas in Jurassic Park, dinosaurs escape the dino zoo, chaos ensues. Plot focused. Except again, fictional concepts rarely fit into a singular box and all things are happening everywhere all at the same time. That phrase tasted wrong. So, a simple formula I use to keep all of it in track. Internal conflict drives the character, external conflict pushes back. That back and forth is all-encompassing in what we call plot. So when a story is plot-driven, it simply means there's more of a focus on that pushback as opposed to the other side of it. And that's the part that excites my curiosity. External conflict pushes back. There is agency. As it relates to the characters, and keep that in mind because it's going to be a running theme, specifically as it relates to the characters, external conflict exists to make their life a living hell. And if you've ever consumed any piece of fiction, I'm sure you're no stranger to the brutalization of characters. Exhibit A, Exhibit B, C, D, E, F, G, H. I am not going to go through every letter of the alphabet, but you get the idea. Make him suffer, my writing motto. But again, that is an extreme simplification of the purpose of external conflict. And I want to start picking apart about the different effects that conflict can have on a character, but before we unsimplify, we have to unpin our first note and talk a little about the different forms, the variety that external conflict comes in. And it's usually to another character or not another character. External conflict in the form of characters can be antagonists, supporting characters, just really anyone who is actively impeding the character in question regardless of intention. And I make sure to add that because of the juicy conflict that comes about when someone is supposed to be on their side but seems to be doing everything in their power not to be. But it gets incredibly diverse in the case of non-characters, nature, society, technology. I simply cannot name every form it appears in, except the separation between character and non-character feels more like semantics than anything else. Because as it exists in the narrative, the goal essentially stays the same either way, which is turning the character into a punching bag. The real question though is, how does the character react to getting sucker punched? No, scratch that. How would you react to getting punched? I don't know about you specifically, but me personally. No, let's take a plethora of people. Maybe they freeze from the shock, run to get some ice, smile and say they have no enemies, or channel their inner Luffy to hit the nastiest right hook of their lives. That scene still lives rent-free in my head. But you get the idea. One thing, one goal, many different outcomes. External conflict exists to make the character's life difficult, but to varying results. And those outcomes will obviously depend on the character, but interestingly, it depends on two sides of them. The first one is the disposition of the character, their personality, their goals, motivations, etc. We'll manifest another pin in that one for now. The second I want to tackle immediately, the character's relation to the narrative, or in other words, what the writer wants. And we start to dive into writing decisions, which is something that always excites me. Picture yourself, the writer, with a character, and you have a pouch of external conflict to sprinkle all over your narrative as you wish. You sprinkle some in the way of motivating your character or sending them into absolute despair. Maybe just slightly to reveal a character trait they possess. Exaggerate their dynamic with other characters or force internal conflict or growth. The list goes on and on and on. And this is where the evolution of the character comes into play. Remember our formula, internal conflict drives the character and external conflict pushes back. But I want to add another layer. External conflict forces internal conflict, and that in turn drives the character until they meet another wall. So it's essentially a cycle. The character's reaction to those obstacles is what determines their evolution over the course of the narrative. Except again, writing decisions. I've been lying to you this whole time. The goal of external conflict isn't to make the character's life hard. It's literally whatever the writer wants. Immersed in a story, it's going to feel that way until you get a little meta, step back a bit. Answers to all those questions are going to depend on where they want to take the narrative. Expertly written characters will always feel like they have their own agency, or lack thereof if it's intentional. But ultimately, it's all the writer's decision, isn't it? And it's using that external conflict, using that obstacle to take the characters to the outcome required for the narrative. Peaky Blinders is a masterclass in this. The character of Thomas Shelby demonstrates his agency over and over again. And every time external conflict pushes back, he acknowledges that obstacle and pivots in a new direction that still puts him on a path towards his goals. Let me take a very quick example from episode 2. Spoilers, but I'll keep it as light as I can. So the whole entire premise of the show is that Thomas runs a little crime syndicate, but his people screwed up, and instead of stealing a crate of motorcycles, they accidentally stole heavy weaponry and ammunition.
25 Lewis machine guns, 50 semi-automatic rifles, 200 pistols.
No, she's so real for that. So some very serious people send a small militia to recover them despite not knowing where they are. Chaos ensues. Now, while Thomas and the gang are out on other business, this militia raids the homes under their protection. External conflict pushing back. How does Thomas react to this sucker punch? He takes the Luffy route. He gets the people to start burning pictures of the king because quote,
"We don't want our beloved king looking down and seeing the things that have been done to us."
And then he makes sure the press knows about it, which puts the leader of this militia in hot water because they were supposed to do this quietly. But not only that, Thomas straight up tells him, hey, I have the weapons you're looking for, and you're going to do exactly what I say. If not, they're heading to some very dangerous people who are definitely going to misuse them. Thomas's goals and ambitions driving his character until he meets another wall. The cycle continues. And one very important note, even though we could have gone a myriad of different places, the conclusion still feels natural. Or less contrived rather, because as I've said in previous videos, everything in a story is technically contrived. But that feeling of natural progression is still important. And the key to that, I think, is tackling our most recent pin, the disposition of the character. How they view the world is going to color every decision they make, as is true for real people. Except characters are fabricated, as we just went over. They are very codependent on the narrative, so it becomes a necessity that they are painfully consistent. And if your immediate gut reaction to that was, ew, I don't want to boring, predictable character, you're completely justified. But consistency and unpredictability don't have to be mutually exclusive. It simply means the character's decisions are grounded in the core aspects of their being, and by extension, their decisions in navigating the obstacles creating that external conflict. So it becomes obvious that nailing those core aspects of their being is paramount in all this, beyond anything else in my opinion. The lore of the character, their beliefs, the key moments, core memories, if you will, that made them who they are. I cannot overstate that. Which is why Inside Out is one of my favorite examples to bring up on this topic, because it almost feels like it was made to be a writing study on character, literally telling you the pivotal aspects of Riley's existence, with personified emotions and physical representations of those core values engraved in her. So when she's met with resistance, that pushback that is external conflict, you can very clearly see how she reverts back to those values and how she uses them to navigate the situation she's in, but also how differently she reacts when she starts to lose those core values because plot reasons. I love finding learning moments in the most unassuming pieces of fiction, and this is where I do a little callback to something earlier. You might have arched a brow when I said one thing, one goal, many different outcomes, except it's rarely ever just universally one thing. I've already touched on this in that external conflict comes in two umbrella forms and an infinite amount of subforms, as many as you have ideas. And I've also touched on how different characters can have different relationships to a singular form of conflict. But while that can be effective, it gets infinitely juicier when that conflict is tailor-made to the character. And this, once again, is about writing decisions. But here, it's mostly about those core aspects of the character's being. It becomes a question of how can we hurt this character in the worst possible way. Hey, what's the motto? Make him suffer, that's right. And when it comes to this question, another one of my favorite examples is Psycho-Pass. So let me lay it out real quick. This world is a cyberpunk near future that is essentially governed by an AI. And the story is a crime thriller that follows our protagonist Tsunemori as she works in a crime division apprehending criminals. But here's the kicker, the weapon they use is also governed by this AI. So they can't pull the trigger unless the AI says, yeah, this person is or could be a threat. And the system mostly works, which is why Tsunemori is a firm believer, despite its flaws. The flaws being the could be part. So yeah, they just look at people who are potential threats but haven't really done anything yet. Of course there's more nuance, but that's essentially it. And so we ask the question, what is the worst possible way to hurt Tsunemori? What external obstacle will damage her the most? There can be multiple answers to this, especially depending on the depth of the character in question. But the answer this writer chose was to create an antagonist who exists completely outside the system. A blatant, obvious criminal that the system deems as an upstanding, respectable citizen. And so, until she captures him, Tsunemori can only watch his killing spree and question her beliefs. So good. Go watch Psycho-Pass. But barring all that, I want to point out that stories with a lot of intensity are my favorite, so I tend to lean into those examples. But that scale of intensity can be cranked way down. It could be as simple as someone with social anxiety forced into a situation where they have to interact with people. One final time, external conflict is incredibly diverse. Not only that, but so are the ways they interact with characters, the way those characters react to it, and the outcome of those reactions. Hope I made some sense. And if I didn't, I have a new perk on the lowest tier of my Patreon where I condense my videos into a one-page doc for your reference. So hopefully I do there. If not, I don't know what to tell you, man. That, or you can keep the character train going and check out my Zuko analysis video. I made it years ago and it's only one in the sea of Zuko video essays, but I think you might like it. That's all for me. Okay, bye.